Hello, everyone, and welcome to For the Love of Language. I'm EJ,
And I'm Stacy. Good to have you here.
and today we're going to talk about inner dialogues, which I will preempt this by saying neither of us are experts in this, but it's a really fun
And
topic.
the field is quite new because it wasn't until like social media really came about that people started talking about this more. So this is a new area of study for both psychologists and linguists alike.
Well, there's actually been ideas of speaking to oneself for a very long time,
Yeah.
but there's been a lot recently.
Yeah, the way that we've been talking about it looks different. Like, I mean, like philosophers in ancient Greece were talking about what it means to like talk to yourself. And then Descartes comes along saying, I think, therefore I am. And what does the process of thinking look like? Is the process of thinking an internal dialogue that goes on?
Right. So this like thinking about thought itself, this kind of
Yes.
recursive question has existed in philosophy for millennia.
Yeah, for such a long time. Yeah, there are a lot of new things and there's a lot of, bigger questions at play. Now, in terms of like the philosophy behind it, we still don't know. That's up for debate. Like philosophers are still hashing that out. But recently, the thing that people have been talking about the most is what is it like for people who don't have an internal monologue or dialogue, depending on how people perceive it. There are some people out there who don't like talk through things, or they don't have like words coming up in their brains, and instead they have like pictures of ideas or like concepts of things. They don't necessarily think in linguistic thought. They think more in just like what we would say like pure semantics, is just like pure ideas.
Or like very visual
Yeah,
thinkers. So
very visual
that's
stuff.
that's a good thought. When we're talking about internal dialogue or internal monologue, what we're talking about is like the sentences that you use when you're thinking, that actual voice inside of your head. And like Stacey said, not everybody experiences that the same way. And this is part of what makes it really, really interesting. There's all sorts of questions that you can go into. But when you think about it, like it makes sense that not everybody has an inner dialogue. Because if you think about it, like when a child is born, they don't yet have language, and yet they are still experiencing the world. So before they get language, you have to still be creating a basis for understanding. And so that's going to be visual or, tactile, or use your different senses that then we later begin to interpret more through words.
Yeah. Now, granted, there is some contest even about children and whether or not they have language. There is a school of thought that says that children do indeed have some sort of inner dialogue or inner monologue, but it is in the universal language, or it is in just like pure syntax and semantics, right? And so they're acquiring the phonology and morphology to piece those things together, but they were like baked in with the semantics and syntax. Now we've talked about that debate before. We won't go
Yeah.
into it again, but there is sort of like some contest about that. But it is true, and it is very much like a fact that grown adults can talk to each other about how they experience their own internal worlds. And for some, it is like a string of linguistic thought of like, oh, you walk into a room and you're like, okay, I'm going to sit at my desk and I'm going to, pour some water into my water bottle. And there's sort of just like a train of thought. Now, there is like, just like rote memory or just like automatic processing. But like if people are thinking through things, they will kind of talk themselves through it internally. And that's more of what we mean by the internal dialogue, where like people who don't necessarily have that, if they're like looking at an Excel sheet and trying to figure out a problem, they might just be like mechanically, visually putting things together and trying things out instead of like talking through something with themselves. I'm just trying to paint us a picture of how I've had people kind of describe these experiences to me so we can kind of understand where the dichotomy is.
Right. Well, and I think it's a good thing to call out too. Like different people are going to describe it different ways.
Yeah.
Not everybody thinks the same. And even like a single person might at some point be thinking visually, at some point be thinking very linguistically. Like there's definitely like we're not trying to say that there are absolutes here.
Yeah. Yeah. This is reality here. There are gray areas everywhere. So there's definitely going to be variation in this experience, but there is in just talking about like internal dialogue, there is clearly a difference for some people of like, oh yeah, no, like if I'm like alone in my room, I have linguistic thoughts with myself where other people don't experience that kind of phenomenon when they're by themselves. And so that's kind of like what we're dancing around, and there's a lot of different ideas as to why this might be the case. From a more, maybe I'll share a little bit on what's kind of going on the psycholinguistic side of things in terms of why there's an internal dialogue. So in psycholinguistic thought, there's this idea that we have like two different processes that like go on. And one of them is like the phonological process. And then one of them is more of the cognitive lexeme process where you're doing like syntax and semantics and stuff. And then there's like the phonological process. And there's also something called the Y model that, you know, says something similar, that there is kind of like a distinction between these two like thoughts. And even neurologically, we see that like the phonological, like hearing things or saying things, happens in a different part of the brain than like syntaxy things. So there's this kind of dichotomy between those two things. And whenever you're listening to something or you're going to generate words, that works through your phonological process, which is like a certain part of your brain that like interprets and generates sounds. And of course, the way things are generated is a little bit more complicated if you're speaking, but people have found that even solitarily, or, you know, if you tell someone to think about something silently, those phonological processes will be functioning. And that kind of indicates that there is something like linguistic going on if you're telling people to think about something quietly. And even in certain MRI studies, I can't name them right off the top of my head, but they have found that some people will even do tiny motor movements within their mouths and articulatory systems to mimic some of the thoughts that are going on in their head. And you might see this if you know somebody who like mutters while they think. They're just being a tiny bit more vocal and activating like their vocal system while they're like doing something. So they might be like muttering through something. So it's not necessarily something coherent, but they are kind of like activating that system, indicating that they're thinking about something. So there is like evidence that there are like that the phonological system does kind of work even in like silent thought. But of course, that's a little bit contested for people who don't think linguistically, or who might just be accessing like visual information as opposed to like that phonological system that we have. They're not necessarily thinking in words, they're thinking in like pictures, because thinking in words and thinking in pictures is a different process. I'm just gonna put that out there. And so like how does what does that mean for that phonological process that we have absolutely seen go on with people in silent thought? So that's kind of where some of the really interesting and juicy part of this comes from.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's actually studies in like the 1920s, 1930s that actually touch on a little bit of what Stacy was just saying here. So like Lev Vygotsky, did some stuff thinking about like, okay, does the inner dialogue come first, or does the social outer dialogue come first? And which that is, an interesting question that goes back to, what Stacey was talking about the universal language debate as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm.
But even, in the early 1900s, they were talking about how children will move their mouths when they're thinking, and then adults eventually move away from that. Maybe they realize it's unnecessary, they stop doing it, and then it just becomes the inner speech. So that's like a theory around how it progresses. And I think if you look into Lev Vygotsky and some of the other researchers, those are like very, very old studies, actually.
Yeah, definitely on the psychology side of
Yes,
things.
definitely.
Because yeah, linguistics didn't really start developing until like the 60s, but there were like some stuff in psychology that touched on like language and stuff. So it
Yeah.
like when we say that linguistics wasn't really happening, we're saying it wasn't like a formalized separate science from psychology until the 60s. That's
Right.
what we're
Because
saying.
there was a lot of linguistic stuff involved in other fields for
Yeah.
sure.
I was just going to say that like the separation between psychology and linguistics didn't happen. And so psychologists were doing linguistic things without necessarily acknowledging that it was different from psychology.
Right. And there is a lot of crossover. Like we still have
There's an
psycholinguistics
insane amount
classes.
of crossover. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, we've mentioned a few different directions that you can go with this kind of inner dialogue discussion. Like what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Like, is it
Mm-hmm.
the speech or thought, or are they the same thing?
Yeah.
But then there's other questions. I think the most common question that I've personally received when it comes to inner dialogue is, what language do you think in when you're
Mm-hmm.
learning or speaking in a foreign language?
Yeah. Why don't you answer that question first, since you have a little bit of a heftier linguistic background in terms of language acquisition? You've got more going on in your brain than I do.
I don't know that I would say I have more going on, but
You have access to more stuff from other languages.
right, I have done a lot when it comes to learning other languages. It's kind of what I did for a lot of my life. And if you haven't listened to some of our other episodes, the reason for that is that I actually grew up moving to a different country every 2 years because of my father's job. So I ended up learning a lot of different languages, and I don't try and keep all of them up at all. But for me personally, I do generally think in the language that I'm speaking in, unless of course you have like, I don't want to say flaw, but like a
Like a
kink in the
glitch.
system, a glitch, right? I'm just imagining, well, what does it mean for a human to glitch? Um,
I mean, I've definitely had brain glitches before.
Right. But you also have this thing of code switching where you may like switch
Yeah.
between languages. So if you don't know a word or how to express something in another language, that word might come to you in your native language. But for me, a lot of the time, if I'm speaking in Spanish, I will be thinking in Spanish. And if I can't think of a specific word, I will speak around the word, describe the word, and still actually mostly stay in Spanish. And, there's we've talked a little bit about that as well. That comes down to strategic competency as well as just overall linguistic competency. But where I think it gets really interesting, if you like throw another level of complexity into this,
Mm-hmm.
is like simultaneous interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have someone that is interpreting from one language to another, you have consecutive and simultaneous. And consecutive would be like, I listen to this message, this person pauses, and then I speak. Versus simultaneous is, this person is speaking, and while they are speaking, I am both listening and speaking at the same time in a different language to
Mm-hmm.
somebody else so that they can understand the message. And I've done a good amount of simultaneous interpretation, and I absolutely love it. And there's definitely other thought that's going on. Like, you have multiple levels of
Yeah.
thought happening at the same time, because you're definitely understanding in one language, you're speaking in another language, and then you also have this like meta thought. There's
Mm-hmm.
like this like super thought going over that, almost like a I'm
It's
having a
it's
hard
it's an
time.
independent thought. It's
Right.
thought that's independent of what's going on at the time.
Right, because like you're observing and you're also at a certain level like analyzing what is being said and thinking about the what best way to approach this while you're both listening and speaking in
Mm-hmm.
different languages. So, like as an example, I had at one point I was volunteering doing simultaneous interpretation with like a headset and stuff. So you're in your like sound booth, you have your headset, and we were actually partner interpreting. So I was
Mm-hmm.
with somebody else. We could flip a little switch so that it would switch who could be speaking into their headset. And so you would have like, okay, you'd be speaking and you want to make that switch be very, very natural. So you'll
Yeah.
actually be like communicating a little bit with your partner interpreter. Like maybe they dive into a domain that you're unfamiliar with or something. And so like while you finish up talking, you're also, doing this third thing. So this sounds a lot like I'm just describing multitasking, but when you're stacking these things on top of each other, then, my meta language that I'm using to think about the interpretation that I'm doing is probably going to be in English personally, while I'm, maybe even if I'm listening to something in Spanish and, my output is in German. I've had situations where I'm interpreting between Spanish and German, neither of which is my native language. You just have some really interesting stuff happen.
Yeah, yeah. And for those at home who think that this is impossible, first of all, it's not, and you can try it. You can do sort of like a self experiment at home if you want to do this. And you don't need to know another language. All you have to do is play a piece of dialogue. Like you could even do this right now. You could talk along with us, which is essentially just like we're saying something, and then you would out loud just say what we just said. You
Mm-hmm.
would be surprised. You would be shocked, dear friends, dear listeners, at how close you can get those to match up. And when you're doing this sort of simultaneous translation, like what EJ is talking about, it's the same process, just a different language. Humans are
Mm-hmm.
really good at being able to talk with somebody to the point where it sounds very, very simultaneous or like near simultaneous.
Yeah, where it gets difficult is actually where you have syntactic differences. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, in German, sometimes when you have like connected clauses, you'll end up throwing the verb to the end of the sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if I'm interpreting from German to English, I need to wait to hear that verb before I can complete the rest of the sentence in
Yeah.
English. And so you'll have a little bit of like this memory waiting and yet still trying to make it sound natural thing going on as well.
Yeah. So it is a natural thing to do. And I'm sure it takes practice, especially if you're jumping with different like syntaxes. But like our listeners at home, you can definitely try this and just see kind of how this process works.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very interesting process. And of course, like when you're juggling multiple languages, you're juggling a lot. But if you're just speaking along with whatever dialogue is there, that is more of an automatic process. And so you can kind of have external meta thoughts about like what's going on because your like phonological system is kind of working independently, just kind of like reproducing what you're hearing. And you're not necessarily having to take a good part of your like problem solving, deep thinking, like part of your brain. And so that can be working on other thought as well. So it's a beautiful kind of layer that you can kind of play with at home and just kind of see how your brain is working on these things. And you can get a glimpse into what EJ has been talking about and kind of what they've experienced with this simultaneous stuff. And so you can maybe see how your thoughts are different or like might be different while you're speaking. Or if you've ever had like oh, I have an idea while I'm sharing an idea with somebody else, but our topic is one thing and my idea is another thing. So I'm going to just store that idea somewhere else. Again, it's kind of like a similar process of just kind of some of the layers on top of cognition and language. And it's absolutely fascinating.
Right? That was like a super big digression there, but I think it was fun. So,
Honestly, okay, valid digression though, because I think it like if you're wondering if you have an internal dialogue, maybe try this exercise. Maybe try speaking along with somebody and seeing how you're generating those like meta thoughts. Because in the
mhm.
moment, you might not realize it, or you maybe have not thought about it, or like you're like people don't often talk about their own internal experiences with other people. So if this isn't a conversation you've had with other people and you've really hashed out like what their world is like versus your world, you can kind of maybe play with this and just kind of like externally look at what your cognitive process is doing while you're kind of just like talking along with something, and just see what happens. Just see what happens.
Right? And that makes me think of that kind of quantum question, like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You can't know
Mm-hmm.
in a very scientific sense, it's you can't know the position and like the motion of an electron at the same time. I think when you're trying to observe your thoughts, that does in some way actually change your thoughts themselves, that doesn't
Absolutely.
but that doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile. It's still like a
Yeah.
very, very interesting exercise, but it's a fascinating problem because thinking about thought changes thought itself. So is it actually possible to know what your basic thought experience is? I don't know.
Yeah, and when we had our episode about the language faculty, this is one of the issues that comes up when considering if there is a separate like part of your brain that does like language, and if you were to examine that in some of the way that language faculty scientists do that, you're essentially thinking about your thoughts, and it's like, is that really scientifically accurate if you're like observing yourself? Like, there's a whole bunch of like weirdness that goes into it. Needless to say, studying thought is messy and
Right?
hard. It's so hard from a scientific perspective.
Yeah. Well, I want to dive into a couple other interesting questions about the inner dialogue.
Yeah.
So I think another thing that's kind of interesting is how you refer to yourself in your
Mm-hmm.
inner dialogue. Like, do you refer to yourself in the first person, in the third person, in the second person? Like, first person would be using I, third person might be, she, he, they. Second person would be you. What do you use when you're speaking to yourself?
I use we, actually.
Ooh, royal.
I honestly, I do. I use like the royal we, and sometimes I'll vocalize that, and people will be like, "Who are you talking about?" And I'm like, "Oh, me." Like I'm using like the royal like we, which is like a weird thing to say because
I
like
love
the
it.
people who have like dissociative identity disorder or who have like alternate like consciousness going on in their systems, they can definitely use we, and it makes sense because there are actual different consciousnesses, conscious, I don't know, the plural of consciousness, working in their brains. But for someone like me who has like a singular identity, it is kind of odd to use the we, but like it, I don't know. I think of it as me, myself, and I, and together we are we.
I love it. I absolutely
Which
love it.
is, yeah, which is very odd, but yeah, I most of the time will use like we, like we're in this together, talking to myself.
See, I feel like I sometimes use we, but I think it's when I'm thinking of myself as part of a larger group
Yeah,
where maybe it's a little bit more normal to use we
like
in
an
spoken language
inclusive
that way,
we,
right?
yeah.
Like an inclusive we. But yeah, that's super interesting. So I think I change how I
Yeah.
refer to myself rather frequently. So I think in terms of I when I'm thinking to myself. I think there is more of that. We, maybe using my own name to refer to myself in my head,
Hmm.
like, oh, that's a problem for future EJ. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it varies a good amount, but it's a fascinating question.
It is. It really is. And it's something that like I didn't super think about until people started calling me out on like using the royal we. And they were like, "Who are you talking about?" I was like, "Oh, like I'm talking about myself. Like I'm using the royal we." And they're like, "Why are you using the royal we?" And I'm like, "I don't know. That's just what like feels good when I'm talking about like me and my internal dialogue and all this stuff that I'm doing." And of course, like socially, I will say that as I because people don't see me as like
As the royalty that you really are.
right? And they don't see me as the queen that I am. Not at all. No, 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 no. But just like it's far more normal to just say I like socially. But if I'm like by myself and I'm like talking myself through something, often like more often than not, it's we,
Mhm.
which is very interesting. Couldn't begin to explain why that is, but yeah, there is like variation as to how people see themselves.
Right. Well, and there's also linguistically some like phrases that don't really work in the first person. So, like, if you were to say, let's do something, what is the equivalent of that statement if you're just speaking to yourself, right? Like, it almost has to be plural.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's true. And I'm sure like other languages handle this differently. And they might have slightly different ways of explaining this. And maybe there is like a first person way of explaining this, but in at least in English, there are a lot of situations that just don't have a first person.
Yeah. I actually had an interesting conversation with a Spanish instructor at one point. I was probably in like middle school or something. But I asked the question, what is the first person imperative? Right? Like, how can you use an imperative when referring to yourself? And there isn't one, right? Like you have to speak in the second person if you're speaking in imperative. And like in English,
Mm-hmm.
let's do something is basically an imperative, but
Yeah,
it's also
let
plural.
us do
Like you
something.
can't
Yeah.
do it singularly. And if you want to do it singularly, it has to be you. Like go do it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's referring to the second person you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you almost have to speak to yourself in the second person or the plural.
Mm-hmm. No doubt somebody has looked into this, and if not, it would definitely be very interesting to kind of
Right. I'm just
examine.
conjecturing. I haven't actually read any studies
Yeah,
on that.
we okay. Look, we prefaced this already. We already told everybody that we're not experts. We're kind of just tossing around ideas and floating some thoughts. That I mean, I've had discussions about some of these things with people at parties and stuff. It's something that people are thinking about and talking about, and we're thinking about it and talking about it, and there are people out there who are doing more in-depth studying about it. And so like we're just really calling out some like cool shit that's going on and acknowledging how hard it is to figure out exactly what's going on. So most of
Right.
the time even scientists kind of just have to make certain assumptions about things, run with it, see where it takes them, and try to jump over all of these hurdles that come with trying to examine the inner mind of like what's under the hood, because neurologically speaking we can't tell. We're just seeing that there's like there's electricity
Right.
moving around, but that's not encapsulating the human experience.
And that's what makes it so interesting is that there's not some like tangible, this is carbon, this is oxygen. Like you can't do that so discreetly and so absolutely with the human mind and with thought. And that's part of what makes it so cool.
Yeah, the only way that we have been able to make concrete our thoughts is through language. And that is why a lot of philosophers just kind of assume that language is thought and thought is language, because it's the way that we've been able to kind of self-examine, right?
Right.
But we don't know what if that's actually like what's going on, if language is thought and thought is language. Like that's something that we can't super pull apart just because they've been so interconnected for ever since humans started speaking.
Definitely. So, we've talked a little bit about several different things, and we talked about how, thinking about thought changes the thought. Let's dive a little bit into, and this might be a little bit more psychological than linguistic, but I think it's fun. So let's dive into deliberately changing your internal dialogue.
Yeah. So deliberately changing your internal dialogue. This would be something like a therapist would say, like, oh, we gotta get rid of your negative self-talk. Or this is something like, introducing mantras or affirmations to kind of like promote positive talk.
Or if you're learning a second language, maybe you want to practice that second language in your head. And so you deliberately change that.
Hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, we know that it's possible because people do it and people say that they do it. And oftentimes we have to just believe people because we just, we have to just believe each other's experiences on this one because we can't see what's going on. But it's really interesting concept, and I was working with a hypnotherapist at one point,
Ooh.
and yeah, and something that she mentioned to me was the real trick with any sort of like removing self-talk or using affirmations or mantras. I can't apply this to like, linguistic internal dialogue or switching, what language your internal dialogue is in, but at least with like mantras and affirmations, part of you has to believe it in order for it to actually kind of have like a positive effect on like your natural patterning of thought. Part of you has to believe whatever it is you're saying.
And that is an interesting distinction, that belief is different from thought.
Right. So, like, if you were to look yourself in the mirror and say, I am beautiful, or I am handsome, I am gorgeous, but there's part of you that doesn't believe that, those are going to be empty words for a while. And so, like, there's like part of yourself, at least this is how she explained it to me, you've got to unlock part of yourself and part of that belief system to buy into the words, otherwise you're just repeating sounds to yourself.
Mm.
So from that kind of experience, it does kind of seem to me anyway that at least with like affirmations and mantras, you can definitely change your perspective, and you can change like your thought patterns if you are prone to certain thoughts. But there is like an element of belief in there, like, you can't just stand and like lie to yourself, because something will be like, nope, sorry, not true, not true, and it's not, and it's going to kind of backfire. So that was something interesting, like an interesting discussion that I had with this hypnotherapist, and I was like, okay, there does seem, at least for me, there does seem to be somewhat of an element of truth to that, right?
Yeah.
Of like, if there is truth in what you're saying, you're more likely to believe it. And that's why like people in like good argumentation, being able to like state the facts or like find the truth in somebody else's argument is more likely to get them to believe whatever it is you're saying, right? So there
Right.
is sort of this element of belief on top of like language and using language to influence thought that kind
Yeah.
of needs to be accessed.
So this is going to get even more meta as I dive into this. But then you get into the question of, right, like, how do you change that belief itself? And maybe repeating mantras and that repetition and that conditioning over time, could that change the belief? Like, belief is a very rational thing, it's a very
Mm-hmm.
emotional thing, it's very multifaceted. And so different things are probably going to work for different people and
Yeah.
different states of mind. But it is a good call out. Like, if you have a clear difference in what you're trying to tell yourself and what you actually believe, then you might need to dive deeper into that belief itself and why you think how you think and address that, through emotion or logic or something else before maybe diving into some of the just repeating something to yourself, which, like Stacey said, like if you're repeating it to yourself, but in your mind, you're like, no, you're not, you're an idiot, when you're trying to tell yourself you're smart, you're smart, you're smart, but your mind is saying no, like you're not actually going to feel any better about yourself. So you do need to make sure that like the actual levels of your inner dialogue, like the dialogue that you're consciously thinking to yourself, and then that like meta analytical dialogue are actually coming into congruence, which
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I mean, there like people have a bunch of ways to kind of do that. You know, therapy is one of them, talking through things.
Therapy is a great thing. Never feel bad for talking to a therapist.
Journaling is also really great. I'm not gonna lie, I really hated journaling up until a couple of days ago, actually, where I was like awake at 3 a.m. and dealing with some like big thoughts and feelings. And I had a realization because I was diving into some of these things and just kind of hashing it out. So kind of by digging at your thoughts, you can get more perspective on things. And I think that's really what it is when you're changing your beliefs is a perspective shift
Yeah.
of like seeing things from a different point of view, and then that can kind of that like changes the way that you're viewing the world, and then kind of how you're using those affirmations and stuff. We're getting into like some interesting like therapeutic topics right now, but this is just something from my experience that I've noticed. And you know, having that understanding of there is sort of like a conscious and unconscious thinking that can go on, that we've been talking about this entire time. It works to make your life better, but it can also kind of make your life worse depending on kind of where you're at with yourself.
Right. Yeah. And I think, neither of us are psychologists or anything. So
We
like
are
if
not.
you are
We
struggling with your inner dialogue, do talk with a therapist. Like go
please.
get the help that you need. But I do think it is a very, very interesting topic and something that's used in a lot of different fields. Like you have corporate psychology of like businesses wanting people to come together and work as a team and be successful.
Yeah.
You have sports psychology where like this
Yeah.
kind of mantra and positive thinking is huge. Like you'll have coaches constantly tell their players like you need to believe that you're going to win. Like there's no way you're going to push yourself to the limit and really try unless you believe that it's possible. And when you don't have that belief, you're just going to give up the game basically, right?
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
that also gets interesting because that belief doesn't guarantee you'll win, because obviously you can have two teams really believing in themselves and then it
And there's
gets
only one
tough.
winner in the end.
Right? Not everybody can win at everything when you have a competitive game. But fortunately, life is not a zero-sum game. So,
Yeah.
uh,
But yeah, this bleeds into like other stuff too. You know, you talked about corporate psychology and sports psychology. This also goes into like religion and how like religions kind of like use certain dialogues or mantras to like influence people or, you know, promote certain thoughts. This also like I've even seen this in gambling. I know someone who like he is a gambling coach and uses some of these things to help other gamblers with stuff. And that's a very interesting thing because, you know, you were saying like in sports, like there is like a determined like outcome, right? But in gambling, a lot of it is like statistics and chance. And it's like, okay, how does like psychology work with like statistics and chance, like stuff that you cannot necessarily influence, but there is, your mental state does kind of like affect your how you're thinking about those statistics and chances, right? So it's very interesting to kind of like see how thought can kind of influence performance or everyday life in different ways. You even think about like advertising is just psychology with money in mind.
oh my gosh, advertising. We should do an entire episode on advertising.
We
And
definitely can,
yeah, because there's so
because
much there. There's so
there's
much
so
there.
much there. especially from a linguistic standpoint
Mm.
of how are people using language to influence others.
And it's changed so much over time. But let's save that for a different
We'll
podcast.
save that for another day. I think we're falling definitely into more of that kind of topic, but we can save that for another day. But needless to say, like your conscious and unconscious thoughts are very much a scientific thing. Like people have found this. It is very much something that is going on, and your internal dialogue and the way that you kind of associate with your own thoughts is something that scientists are still working on and looking into, and seeing how that like influences your thoughts, and how like language kind of layers on top of that is very complex and very beautiful.
Definitely. Yeah. I think we just covered a broad array of tangents and thoughts related to
We
thought and inner
did, man.
dialogue.
In our preface, we should have told everybody to buckle their seatbelts because goddamn.
I mean, it's not abnormal for us to just dive into a ton of different things. So hopefully our listeners are just expecting it and enjoying the ride.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you all for being here. EJ, are there any last thoughts about any of this kind of stuff? We've talked about a lot.
I think let's call it there.
All right, fantastic. Make sure to follow us on Instagram for the love of language. Hit us up with your experiences with our little thought experiments. Send us questions, send us ideas for things you might want to hear about. We love people in our own lives ask us to cover certain topics. So we are happy to kind of cater the podcast to our listeners. We love and appreciate all of you, and we'll see you around on the next one.
Ciao.